I'm Miriam Turner, 27, and I'm standing at the audio console at the back of a glass-walled ballroom while vows begin. Lydia, my sister, tightens her grip on Andrew Kincaid, my sister's fiancé, just as the slideshow's music glitches. My cue, not a mistake. Senator Mark Dalton, the efficient, freezes when he opens the embossed envelope I hand-delivered to his lectern and reads a summary of crimes into a live microphone. Mom's smile drops, Dad's jaw sets. Graham Pike, the crisis fixer my father hired, bolts toward the stage, too late to stop the recording of a mother's voice and a dead boy's name. I switch inputs. The house speakers push the truth louder than their money ever could. Lydia looks at me like she finally sees me. Before I tell you how a family made me disappear and how I made them hear the name they buried, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and switch on notifications for more surgical family revenge stories. I was raised to be useful, not visible. In our house, usefulness was the currency and silence the rule. I learned to iron silk until it looked like a glossy photograph, to fold thank you notes into perfect rectangles, to bring the right bottle to the right dinner so Mom could smile without thinking about anything but the applause. When guests left, they praised the Turners for being so gracious, and the praise landed on my hands and shoulders without lodging in my name. I was the one who made the family presentable. I was not the one who occupied the photograph. Praise was given when I smoothed someone else's wrinkle. If I asked for help, it sounded selfish. If I spoke up in a room where donors were counted, I heard the polite exchange of looks that meant go small. The college tutor bills, the summer programs, the camera-ready gowns, all of it was allocated to Lydia. My wins became proof of a Turner work ethic for someone else's application. My mistakes became a stain I was expected to clean. The message was simple and repeated until it felt like oxygen: be small or be a problem. For a long time, I chose small because it was safer. That safety made me invisible. I learned silence as if it were an instruction manual. When I wanted anything, I learned to ask in the tone of a favor, not a demand. I learned to fold myself into the background during speeches, to laugh at stories I did not find funny, to hold bouquets and props that made someone else's life photograph better. Being useful kept the house operating, Mom's hair done, Dad's schedule smoothed, Lydia's image maintained. But usefulness also taught me how to catalog things people said when they thought no one was listening. I listened. I remember receipts, offhand remarks, a body shop name murmured over scotch. Those memories sat in me like seeds waiting for rain. Mom curated everything: colors, faces, and even the volume of other people's grief. She taught me that sorrow had its acceptable level and that public displays must be calibrated for sympathy and camera angles. She chose seating charts with the precision of a stage director, decided who would laugh at which lines, and instructed staff to stand where they would look best in photographs. Her idea of charity was a photo opportunity with a check and a press release attached. The household operated on a simple economy: appearances in exchange for access. Dad handled donors, contracts, and introductions to politicians. He called it community leadership and filed it under philanthropy. He kept a Rolodex that felt like a small city and used it like a map. We had a foundation with a board and a PR firm on retainer tools that turned awkward moments into carefully worded apologies. The rule, spoken and unspoken, was never contradict the family line in public. Tradition and carefully placed remorse were forms of control. Humility got sold as a virtue when it protected a family name. Lydia was the face they polished. She learned early that contrition was a costume that could be put on when the cameras came. My job was scaffolding: hold her up, make the moment, and be unseen. I learned to time my laughter to match a flash. I learned to let her occupy the center of every frame, to let my achievements be footnotes in someone else's narrative. The house ran on that choreography. I provided the stagehands, they took the spotlights. The wounds that trained my silence started small and left permanent grooves. At 9, I won a regional essay contest. Mom insisted Lydia accept the plaque because it suits her college file. The plaque sat on Lydia's desk, and I learned that recognition could be redirected like a traffic cone. When I tried to point that out, I was told to be grateful for family good fortune. Gratitude, not ownership, became the expected response. At 12, I reported a coach for crossing lines. Dad handled it with a phone call and a promise that things would be fixed. The coach stayed. My teammates started to whisper that I was a liar. I learned the cost of truth in a community that preferred tidy reputations. Speaking up had consequences: exclusion from games, awkward dinners, a sense that I had taken something and made people uncomfortable. At 14, Lydia dented Mom's car in a parking lot. I was told to take blame to spare her reputation during college applications. I remember the metallic taste of the apology I gave in the driveway, the way I repeated phrases until my voice sounded like a script. The dent was buffed and painted. I was congratulated for maturity. The lesson was no longer subtle. At 16, I asked why the foundation paid a florist's bill that was longer than a usual donation. Dad said, "Learn our priorities or stay out of them." He smiled in the way that made me feel small and dangerous at once. Each truth I tried to speak cost me access or affection, sometimes both. I started to store facts like weapons I was forbidden to use, keeping receipts in a drawer and questions in the back of my head. I stopped asking for fairness and began memorizing what they wanted unrecorded. The memory of their language, the casual dismissals, the jokes that cut became a map of the house I carried wherever I went. I overheard parts of conversations that had no place in polite family life. Body shop, someone said once over scotch, then cash, and then foundation, like it was all one tidy sentence. Dad's mouth softened when he said optics, and I felt the word on my skin like a cold hand. The housekeeper's son, a kid named Leo who mopped the side porch and brought home extra rice for his little sister, stopped showing up for work. At first I assumed he'd found a better job. Later I learned the word troublemaker had been used as a warning in his direction. No one told me to forget the name, they simply stopped answering when I asked about him. Lydia's behavior changed in small ways that added up. She stopped driving before dawn, suddenly too nervous to take the long way to rehearsal. She began rehearsing apologies for little transgressions as if she were practicing costumes. At night, I lay awake and replayed the fragments I'd heard. Cash repair, special handling, community relief, words that didn't belong in our living room calm. I tried asking Dad a direct question. He smiled, told me to mind my own business, and praised Lydia for being photo-ready for a summer gala. The smile closed the subject like a lid. I remember looking at the family calendar where Dad penciled in events and thinking the dates lined up with something else I had seen on a newsstand years before. I did not yet know the name Evan. We never spoke his name at home. Whatever had happened at dawn was buried under polite apologies and quick repairs. The silence around it was deliberate. It had edges and weight. I learned those contours then, the way a family can fold a disgrace into its routine like a hand tucking away a letter. By 20, I was an expert at vanishing. It was practical rather than mystical, a set of habits honed because survival in my family meant not being visible. I could pack a bag in 10 minutes, leaving no obvious trace of my route. I knew how to burn a credit card and replace it with cash, how to take a bus with a face that didn't invite recognition. Prepaid phones, library computers, and public mailboxes became tools. I worked temp jobs that required me to do the work, answering phones, inventorying back stock, scanning archives, without anyone needing to ask about my family history. Those jobs were quiet, they let me be small on purpose. I taught myself to read filings and track shells not because I wanted to be a detective but because facts are stubborn things and I preferred to have them on paper. Microfilm in an archive became a companion, rows of printed images that hummed at night, and I learned how to read a ledger like a map. People underestimated someone who apologized quickly. I used that to my advantage. No one expected the apologetic woman at the reference desk to be cataloging donors and tracing payments in her spare hours. Vanishing isn't drama, it's logistics. It is prepaid envelopes, names scrubbed from subscriptions, social media left inactive, cash tucked into a shoe, and a rented mailbox at the edge of town. It meant learning to be an efficient background. It also meant I had time to watch patterns form, studying receipts, memorizing how certain vendors showed up again and again at the same events, noticing when invoices were oddly round or when foundations made donations at the exact moment an awkward thing needed covering. I learned that a woman nobody noticed could watch everything and make plans that required no one's permission. The family rule about truth was simple: tell a truth only if it could be monetized or turned into a headline that benefited the Turners. Mom would correct you when you said cover up by saying, "We don't lie, we curate." That was her version of a moral lesson. Translation: bury what you must, shape what you show. Dad's favorite line, delivered with a calm that felt like an iron gate closing, was, "Protect the family, then the city, then the truth if it isn't inconvenient." He was methodical about hierarchy. It was less about what was right and more about what kept the donors calling. Lydia learned early that contrition could be a costume and that shame could be polished into a public lesson. She wore apologies when they were useful and handed them off like props the moment the cameras left. Mom taught her how to cry on cue, Dad taught her how to make a glance land in a photograph. I learned that asking the wrong question in the wrong room marked you as embarrassing and that the label stuck because people in my orbit preferred quiet. They didn't exile me for being imperfect, they pushed me out because I remembered things. When I asked a question about a bill, about a phone call, about why Leo no longer worked certain shifts, the answers were practiced. Mom would sing the family's virtues and pivot. "We do this for the greater good," she'd say, arranging a napkin with precise fingers. Dad would talk about responsibility and the burden of being seen. They framed silence as a virtue and wove it into a script that rewarded compliance. Saying the wrong thing didn't just make you unpopular, it made you expendable. I remember the exact tone Mom used the day she told me the greatest gift I could give was to step back. The pity in it was almost polite. I left town because they asked me to, and because I chose to take that exile and make it mine. I moved into a small studio above a thrift store with sunlight that came in at a narrow angle and dust motes that looked like slow snow. The building's pipes groaned at night, the thrift shop's bell chimed at noon. My bed was a second-hand mattress I wrapped in a clean sheet. I paid cash for groceries at the corner market and learned the names of the night janitor and the woman who ran the diner across the street. The apartment smelled faintly of old books and lemon cleaner. I worked scanning microfilm for a small newspaper archive. The machines hummed like old refrigerators. The reels spun and spat out headlines I read one after another with a patience that felt like prayer. No one asked about my family photo albums. No one called me by anything but my first name. I kept my phone number fluid and my accounts minimal. I let myself be seen in the small ways that mattered, by the barista who learned my order, by the neighbor who knocked when the heat failed. I wasn't happy, not the way people imagine happiness, but I had something I'd never had at home: safety in anonymity. I collected quiet the way other people collect seashells. I learned bus schedules and where the park bench was dry at dawn. I taught myself to sleep even when the city felt loud. For the first time, the silence was choice, not command. And then a headline unspooled beneath a scanner one afternoon, and the quiet ended. They cried and toasted and talked about alliances like it was a word that belonged to board meetings, not bedrooms. When it was my turn, they asked me to help with the little things: candles, slideshow edits, seating for less photogenic relatives. Lydia slid a list across the table and said, in that bright voice she used when she wanted something to sound like a favor, "Miriam, can you handle the left side of the room?" The list smelled faintly of perfume and glue. The gratitude I felt, the way someone feels a draft, noticeable, unavoidable, and I said, "Congratulations," because that is what you say. I could feel the room rearranging itself around Lydia. Donors murmured approval. The guests exchanged glances that meant invitations and favors. The guest list for the engagement party was a who's who: people whose names opened doors for Dad and whose applause paid for Mom's hosting. My assignments were small but precise. Sit where servers won't block cameras, laugh on cue, make sure no one notices the way Lydia straightens her lap. When I hesitated, my no hanging in the air like a record scratch, Mom's eyes cut to me with a warning that didn't need words. It was the same look she used when a table placement went wrong, precise, measured, and final. I started documenting the instructions then, out of habit more than intent. I copied texts and saved emails, took photos of seating charts on my phone, and wrote notes on napkins with details that seemed unimportant until they weren't. Those small records felt like a secret contraband. I filed them the way I had learned to fold receipts in the family drawer. The dinner ended in a made-for-press photograph. Lydia in center, Dad's arm a practiced arc around her shoulders, Mom's smile perfect. I stood near the service door, clutching the list, feeling like a prop. The announcement had been an offering to the public, and my role was to smooth every edge so the world could look at the Turners and be convinced. Everything about the preparations smelled like control. The planner arrived with fabric swatches and a binder, her nails clicking on the leather cover as she presented a sister highlight reel concept that placed Lydia in the middle of every frame. The first draft of the slideshow had a montage of childhoods where my face was cropped, where photos of me were background props, an arm, a shoulder, a back turned toward the camera. When I asked why a few photos were omitted, the planner smiled and said we were streamlining the narrative. Streamline, a nice word for erasure. They assigned me a corner table near a service door visible only as convenience to staff. The dress code that arrived in an email included a personal note for me about hair and shoe color, phrased like advice but intended as instruction. Lydia's friends were told to shine, while I received guidance about not clashing. Dad pulled me aside and said, "Board members notice everything," as if that were a favor and a threat in one sentence. It landed like a hand on my shoulder that wouldn't let me straighten. The family group chat titled itself The Perfect Weekend, and it filled with schedules, timing, and a tone that meant control. I archived every message and backed up copies on my own cloud. I had stopped trusting even the watermarks on their PDFs. The planner rehearsed speeches with Lydia and Dad. Each anecdote about me was reduced to a charm, Miriam's quirky phase, meant to be a footnote of tolerable eccentricity. I watched camera rehearsals during the last walkthrough and saw how the videographer planned to pan the room. First the parents, then the bride, then any necessary reaction shots. The choreography was meticulous. They were building an image that left no room for me to inhabit. They tested lines and boundaries as if I were a variable to be set. Mom asked me, with the soft voice she used when she needed obedience not debate, to uninvite a former nanny for optics. The nanny had been a quiet presence when I was a kid, the only person who remembered the exact shade of my laughter. When I refused, Mom's face hardened and she called me uncooperative and ungrateful. Dad suggested I skip the speeches and offered taxi money like it was a gift for my benefit. It read like a consolation rather than control. Lydia made a joke about my apartment above a thrift store and said, "Don't bring that smell," then added casually, "Can you hold my train?" The way she said it was a test, too light to be cruel on purpose, heavy enough to be exclusion. Andrew tried on remarks about ambition and eligibility, half flirt with authority, half assessment. He smiled at my answers like a man measuring the walls of a room he might own someday. Each of those sentences had subtext. This is not sisterhood, this is buffering. I began to keep a ledger of all the small pressures, the micro-requests that tightened like a strap. The seating was engineered to shadow me. They placed me under a spotlight crossfade so photos would catch me in half-light. The microphone stand at the lectern was centered, and there was another mic tucked away where only approved speakers would find it. The slideshow included 2 childhood photos of me, one with a stain on my dress from a spilled drink and another where my eyes were closed mid-laugh. Lydia's frames were flawless, no smudges, no awkward angles. The planner rehearsed each moment with precise timing. My name appeared in Mom's notes only as a joke, Miriam's quirky phase, penciled like a gag. I watched camera rehearsals and the videographer's route like a runner memorizing a track. He practiced pans that left me in frame only if someone else's hand pointed to me. The stage hands talked about lighting temperature and lens flares with the kind of focus usually reserved for theater. They were constructing a narrative where I was scenery, not subject. I noted every prop, the placement of the audio rack, the location of the backup mic, the way the florists planned to drape roses so no one would see the seam between the head table and the audience. They were building a scene that would look casual to everyone watching but was, in fact, a script with me as the punching bag. I cataloged the props and the cues not out of malice but because they'd trained me to notice what others wanted hidden. The stage was set, every angle covered, every laugh rehearsed. I sat in the wings and counted breaths, learning where the stage would hold and where it would break. Lydia texted later that night. "Try not to do the martyr thing this weekend." The message had a smiling emoji that made it sound casual, but the words were a line drawn in the sand. At a donor luncheon the next day, a woman I barely knew, Mrs. Hargreaves, took my hand and said, "You're the quiet one, so elegant not to need attention." She meant it as flattery, but the way she said it was preparation. A voice priming a room to accept my absence. I felt my mouth close around a protest that had nowhere to go. The hints arrived in other, smaller ways. The planner called to confirm a sister shot and then asked, as if trying an experiment, "Miriam, are you sure you'd still like the left side table?" Her tone was clinical, almost polite. The invitations were printed and folded, and I noticed my name listed on page 2 among the service staff and not under the family. Each small thing was a nudge, a practiced shape they were forcing my life into. Absent, convenient, forgiven as long as I stayed invisible. It would have been easy in a different life to accept their framing. Leave, change my number, take the polite taxi fare Dad suggested, disappear into a life that smelled faintly of thrift stores and second-hand books. But the way Mom said privacy had an edge, it wasn't mercy, it was containment. The phrase meant they preferred a convenient quiet over any messy truth I might insist on. That distinction, mercy versus control, settled over me like cold water. It made the air thin and sharp. I packed a bag before the engagement party because they asked me to and because I was learning to answer with action instead of argument. I tucked in clothes that didn't show the shapes of my body under flashbulbs, a toothbrush, and a small notebook. I left a duffel in the trunk of my car like an insurance policy, but the packing was different this time. I wasn't running to hide. I was arranging an exit route the way someone sets a chessboard. I wanted options. I wanted to see every door. That week I began to plan quietly, not a dramatic plan. I cataloged facts. I wrote down every offhand remark about the car that had been fixed with cash, every mention of a body shop that had closed the books on a job, every time someone used the word optics like a hammer. I saved screenshots of messages and folded them into a file labeled "The Weekend." With each note, I felt less like a prop and more like someone collecting evidence for a later moment. The collection felt secret and careful, the same way Mom kept her guest lists and Dad kept his ledgers. I scheduled practical things: new SIM cards, a mail hold, a bank card to use without linking it to my name. I figured out bus schedules and the quickest routes out of the city if the night demanded it. I read photography blogs for tips on how a photographer frames a sister's shot so I could anticipate camera angles. I scouted the venue online, studied where vendor doors usually sit, and made a mental map of the AV closet that vendors always use. These actions were small and precise, not dramatic, and each one calmed me a little by converting worry into logistics. But more than logistics, I shifted my internal posture. I decided not to plead or negotiate in the room where everyone watched. I rehearsed the words I would allow myself to say, "Understood." "Congratulations." They were short, neutral, and gave nothing away. The words were a shield that kept me from becoming the spectacle they wanted. Inside, my thoughts became a long list of what to preserve: receipts, names, and small anomalies. I would not argue with them in the dining room while plates were passed. I would not let their public scripts erase facts I remembered. Part of the pivot was letting go of imagined allies in the room. The people who would defend me, if any existed, were also people who traded favors for invitations. Asking them to choose would be asking too much. I accepted that most of the faces in that ballroom had already chosen the side of comfort. That acceptance clarified my options. I could leave the house and become invisible on their terms, or I could walk the stage they set and collect witnesses. I began to think in timelines and nodes: who was present at what time, where the cameras would be, who would record sound. On the eve of the engagement party, I changed my phone number and set up a burner email. I wrote down, in a small notebook with a bent spine, the phrases that had mattered over the years. Be small, be useful, learn our priorities. I folded the notebook and slid it into the pocket of a coat I planned to wear to the party. Folding it felt like putting a map into my palm. The map didn't tell me every move, but it marked the cliff's edge and the exits. I slept poorly that night, but with a purpose. The pivot was not an emotional breaking so much as a sharpening. I stopped being a passive thing to be moved and began to be an agent with tools. I arrived early on the day of the party because being early lets you see the room before the story begins. The venue smelled of fresh-cut roses and lemon polish. I walked the perimeter and checked the service entrances under the guise of helping a florist lug a box. Lydia rehearsed lines with a bridesmaid in a whisper. Family values, she said, the phrase soft and rehearsed, and I listened to timing the way an editor listens for a misplaced comma. Mom fussed with a boutonniere, pinning and repinning as if perfect placement might alter guilt. Dad walked through a charming anecdote about me to the videographer, smiling like the man who always turned memories into media. I sat near a stack of inventory crates, feeling the plaster of the ballroom cool under my palm. I watched camera rehearsals and listened to the tech's test levels. The sound of their voices, countdowns, and mic check 1 2 became a metronome. I watched how staff moved, where shadows collected, how light would fall across faces during a toast. It was not paranoia, it was reconnaissance. Knowing the terrain made me less vulnerable. The room itself was a lesson in who mattered. The chairs were arranged to frame Lydia and Andrew, the stage raised just enough to make them statues. The vendor table showed where staff would circulate. The AV racks promised where sound could be rerouted if you knew the cables. I checked the exits and the nearest public sidewalk, knowing where a crowd thinly gathers after an interrupted ceremony. I sat on the edge of their world and listened until I could anticipate the first misstep. Waiting felt like holding my breath until the moment I decided to exhale. The ballroom had mirrored columns that multiplied the faces into a city of watchful observers. High ceilings swallowed sound and returned it with a soft echo, like a room that remembers gossip. The stage was framed in roses and a low arch that made vows look like promises carved in film. Guests arrived in suits and gowns, donors whose names unlocked board seats, editors with notebooks tucked under arms, and a campaign photographer whose lenses recorded the exact angle of every smile. 2 microphones stood at the front, one at the lectern for approved speeches, polished and waiting, another on a floor stand farther in, meant for family blessings and the inevitable toasts. Lydia positioned herself center frame with practiced ease. She wore the look of someone born to be photographed, chin lifted, shoulders softened, a smile calibrated not to expose anything real. I was placed near a service door by design, a half step from the aisle where servers could weave around me and cameras could avoid me if necessary. The photographer directed a sister's shot and told me to hold a clutch, which meant my hands would be a prop and my face a background. Servers in black waited like punctuation marks, their plates gleaming under the chandeliers. The air smelled faintly of perfume and fresh icing. It was a room engineered to look effortless. I watched the videographer practice pans that would pass over me in 3 seconds if anyone needed a reaction shot and linger on Lydia if the cameras were satisfied. The microphones stood like judges on pedestals, waiting for approved testimonies. The arrangement told me who would be seen and who would be erased. I mapped the audience in my head, noting donors who hated scandal, a local editor who liked civic redemption stories, a campaign aide standing politely by the senator. The room was a machine for producing image and sanctioning silence, and I had come to learn all its levers. I felt the hum of the chandelier, the cold of the crystal against my neck, the way the air smelled faintly of roses and champagne. The photographer's camera clicked the way a metronome keeps time, and I could see the flash catch the exact second my face went neutral. Mom adds a line about honoring boundaries, and Dad calls me courageous for choosing what's healthy for everyone. Their words twist like a ribbon. What they call generosity is removal. What they call courage is exile. Someone near me, an older donor whose name opens doors, leans over and murmurs a bold move as if we are discussing decor. Phones lift across the room. I can feel the heat of that many screens aimed like lances. The planner smiles at the stage, her hands practically trembling with relief that the choreography landed. Servers move like clockwork, their trays a bright punctuation of the moment. I am suddenly aware of every small sound. The clink of a fork, a child's laugh at a distant table, the soft sob of a woman who once stood where I stand now but who left the room before the toast finished. The photographer angles for the sister's shot, Lydia radiant, Dad's arm around her, Mom's expression polished into a kind of grieving pride, and instructs me to hold a clutch, to look down modestly. I do as directed. The camera takes the frame he wants, my face is shaped into what they need it to be. The humiliation is not just spoken, it is documented. Guests record the moment without asking, their phones catching the exact phrasing that will circulate by morning. A donor's daughter leans in and says, brutal, but keeps her phone raised. A server's whispered, "Are you okay?" gets a small, practiced nod from me. The nod becomes the only live kindness in the room. I hear the rustle of a napkin as someone slides it across a table to stifle a laugh. The photographer's assistant thumbs something into his phone, and an editor in the corner exchanges an inscrutable look with a campaign aide. Mom's smile never fully returns. The muscles around her mouth twitch like an actor who forgot a line. Dad's jaw tightens until I can see the tendons shift. Graham Pike, who had stationed himself at the back like a vigilant shadow, bolts toward the stage when he realizes the moment has become viral in a single instant. He is too late. The recording has started. The room is now a witness, a gallery of impartial onlookers and documentary devices. The planner claps at the end of Mom's sentence as if cueing applause. The applause is mechanical. I stand, small and precise, and let the room fold around me. Phones keep recording. People who will never speak to me again will own the clip. They will watch it over drinks and forward it in closed chats where reputations are weighed and sentences decided. The humiliation is not only felt, it's archival. It will exist outside my memory, a second testimony of shame that others will replay to confirm their judgments. That realization makes something in me settle. If they are building a record, then I will build one too, one that tells a different story, one that names what they are trying to erase. I stepped to the second mic because that was where they expected me to go, because that was where a family blessing would be given and where a scripted apology would be safe. I say, with the exact phrasing I had practiced in the mirror, understood. Keep my voice steady, no tremor, no pleading, no attempt to charm my way back into a family that treats silence as virtue. I pick up my clutch, feel the leather in my palm, walk the path the planner has cleared for me, past the videographer whose equipment hums like a small animal, and hold myself still until the double doors close behind me. Outside, the summer air hits my face like a truth. The party's music becomes distant, muffled by the ballroom walls, and the scent of roses warps into the sharp tang of car exhaust. I go to my car, open the trunk, and take only what fits in a duffel: my passport, a change of clothes, a notebook, chargers, and a small stack of cash. I remove the family chat from my phone, delete the thread, and forward a single message to an email I control. The words I had practiced the night before, I will give them truth, with witnesses. I switch SIM cards in a cafe 2 blocks away, send a mail hold to my apartment, and close the P.O. box I had been using for quiet correspondences. My breath is even, my hands steady. There is no drama, only motions of preparation. On the bus that takes me away from the house, I write a single sentence in a cheap notebook. I will give them truth with witnesses. I underline it twice. The bus's heat hums under my thighs. A toddler on board drops a juice box and sobs until a mother picks it up and teaches the child how to breathe. I look at the faces of strangers who don't know my family and feel almost banal relief. The bus stops at every corner, people coming and going, anonymous and necessary, and I let myself be one of them. I sleep badly that night in a studio above a thrift store, but I sleep with plans and papers buffered against the edge of my bed. 2 weeks later, in a basement that smelled of dust and ink, I found the headline that finished my pretending it was possible to be small and safe. The microfilm machine whirred like a patient animal, frames of newspapers unspooled under a scanner with a thin, metallic whisper. The headline crawled past in block letters. Teen dies in dawn hit and run. The photo was grainy but clear enough, a luxury SUV with a cracked fog lamp. My chest tightened in a way a muscle does when it remembers an old injury. The date on the paper matched the week Dad's SUV had gone to service, the summer Lydia turned 17. The article named a suspect, a young man from the neighborhood, Leo Alvarez, the housekeeper's son who worked for our family briefly and then vanished from my life as if he'd never existed. There was a small paragraph tucked into the middle of the article, a donation from the Turner Family Foundation to assist the grieving. The words looked like a parenthesis, like something someone had meant to hide inside a larger sentence. But the microfilm made all of this public and permanent. I printed the article against the blinking green light of the printer and the smell of toner filling the room. I labeled the printout Cole headline and slid it into a folder I had already titled in my head. Cole. The machine groaned on, spitting out other stories about zoning meetings and a school board's budget debates, but the one about the hit and run settled in me like a stone. I sat there for a long time with my fingers on the paper's edge, feeling the grain under the pad of my thumb. The quiet hum of the archive felt like the calm before labor. The headline didn't just name an incident. It placed a dot on a map I had been tracing in my head for years. I made a photocopy of the microfilm frame, adjusted contrast to bring the fog lamp's crack into sharper relief, and compared it to the catalog images of Dad's model online. The shapes matched. The coincidence was now a lever. I felt the first flicker of an idea that had been growing like a hairline crack in stone, a plan that needed documents and witnesses and the patience to line them up. The archive room smelled of old paper and lemon cleaner. It felt like the right place to start a small revolution. The machine at the archive gave me time to think in small movements. I measured the photo with a ruler, then used on-screen tools to stretch contrast until the crack showed as a thin white scar. I printed a high-contrast copy and taped it next to a dealer brochure I'd pulled from an online archive. Seeing them side by side felt like putting two puzzle pieces on a table. I could have chalked it up to coincidence, but each coincidence stacked until it looked like a floor I could walk on. I went digging for service records. Publicly accessible DMV recall pages and manufacturer bulletins told me what parts were consistent for that model and the year. I cross-referenced part numbers and shapes. Then I started calling body shops in the area, not the mom-and-pop paint places, but the discreet shops that handled VIP cars. My voice was careful and ordinary. I asked about parts availability and how long certain trims took to repair. One owner named a local shop I'd heard in passing, the kind with private bays and no waiting room. He said it had turned difficult jobs around quickly for customers who wanted discretion. Paper is a map. I pulled foundation filings for the Turner Family Foundation and scanned the year after the accident. A $25,000 disbursement to a nonprofit that had formed 2 weeks after the reported hit-and-run caught my attention. The new nonprofit's board list was thin. A treasurer listed an unfamiliar name, but the contact address matched the billing address of one of the body shops. It was the kind of slip you get when people mean to hide money but forget to change small details. I looked for insurance claims tied to our address through a consumer data service I'd learned to use. It gave me loss run summaries with names redacted but with descriptors: owner paid repair, no insurer claim. That line had a meaning. It told me someone had chosen cash repairs instead of involving a company whose forms would create a permanent, searchable record. I found a former bookkeeper's small claims filing in a local court archive, an old exhibit that mentioned cash. Special Project VIP. It was a clerical complaint, a note about unpaid overtime, but the ledger attached named dates that matched the week the SUV went to service. Little notches, little windows. I photographed everything, made notes along the margins, and built a timeline on a sheet of paper. Date of the accident, week the SUV was servicing, dates of the foundation donation, ledger entries, the week Leo stopped working. Finding Leo began like all difficult things do with public records and patience. Court documents showed an obstruction plea and probation conditions. They gave an old address, a probation hearing date, and the outline of a case that had curious gaps. I spent afternoons asking at places where he might have worked. I asked a janitor at a restaurant where a lot of students clocked in. He remembered Leo and told me the kid had a polite smile and that his mother worked 2 jobs. He named a bar where Leo picked up shifts and threw in a caution: don't bring trouble to them. I went the slow way. I walked past the bar at closing and left my note on its bulletin board, simple, unthreatening. I believe you, it read, with a number that connected to a voicemail box I controlled. It was a small promise, the kind that matters when someone has been marginalized, not a demand, just acknowledgement. 2 days later, Leo called. His voice was slow, cautious, like someone testing a thin ice. We met at a coffee stall where steam fogged the windows and people read newspapers in comfortable anonymity. I didn't bring documents at first. I sat and listened. He told me about a night shift when he had been asked to move a car, and how the back door of the garage had been open and a man in a dark jacket had paid cash. He told me about the hush money that trickled into his mother's bank account, the way offers were phrased like favors: a little help for your family. He said he had been scared into pleading to obstruction because the prosecutor said it would be better for him, and that if he fought it he would never work again. Leo flinched when he said Turner, like the word had teeth. I slid him a printed copy of the microfilm photo and watched him study the fog lamp. For a moment he looked like a man who had carried a burden and suddenly had the shape of it. He said he had seen the car, washed it late at night, and felt a shift in how people treated him afterward. Less eye contact, fewer shifts, a coy dismissal from employers who'd once been friendly. He remembered an envelope with cash and a look that said not to ask questions. He agreed to let me record his recollection only after I promised him a lawyer would look at the plea. He wanted safety before truth, and I understood that. I left him with my number and a printed timeline I had begun to shape. He called back 2 nights later with an address where his mother kept important papers. Finding Ruth Cole was different. Her name came up in an obituary I'd found while tracing local news items. The address was modest, 1 bedroom above a laundromat with a stoop that sagged in the middle. I knocked, and the door opened to a woman whose face had been folded into the kind of exhaustion that time and grief carve in people. Her living room looked like a small museum. Track medals arranged in a line, Evan's letter jacket draped over a chair, and a shoebox labeled answers I never got sitting on the coffee table. Ruth asked me to sit at the edge of their small sofa and offered me a glass of water. I told her I had read the article that mentioned a donation from a foundation. She did not flinch at the name. She had been waiting for it, maybe as if the community's silence had kept her awake. She pulled a stack of letters from that shoebox, thin envelopes with her handwriting filling the pages. She read me one aloud at my request, her voice breaking and then steady, the way a recorder warms and then holds a sound. The letter she had sent to the foundation asked simply what happened to her son. It asked for answers and for empathy. The foundation had acknowledged it with a perfunctory note and a donation that Ruth said felt like a stone dropped in a pond with no ripple. I told her who I was, no excuses, no half-truths. I told her about the microfilm headline and the fog lamp, the ledger with cash written in a clerk's hand, the foundation donation that lined up too neatly. I said I had come because I believed some truths deserved witnesses. She let me talk and then asked, plainly, what I wanted. I told her I wanted to make sure Evan's name was spoken in the same rooms that had held the silence. I wanted to clear Leo's name if it had been used as a shield. I wanted the facts to be framed where everyone could see them. She placed 3 conditions on that plan. First, Leo's name had to be cleared publicly with legal assistance ready to undo a coerced plea. Second, Evan's name had to be spoken in the places that mattered, the podiums, the articles, the recorded moments, so that it could not be quietly airbrushed later. Third, there would be no deals without her voice included. Ruth did not want apologies that were bargains in back rooms. She wanted public reckoning and accountability. Her voice, when she said these things, was raw but steady. She wanted truth with witnesses, and she wanted to be the one to speak. We recorded her reading another letter in her living room, the tape catching the small movements of her hands as much as her words. The sound of her voice reading the lines she'd written years before felt like lifting a veil. It was slow and unadorned, and I knew in that quiet room with old paper and damp keys that her demands were not unreasonable. They were precise. She wanted names spoken. She wanted the ledger shown. She wanted whoever had arranged it all to know the weight of what they'd buried. I left her with a copy of the notes I had compiled and a promise I would not move without her. We agreed to meet again and to keep the timeline tight. The house felt more like a planning room than a place of mourning. It had become a place where witnesses started to gather. I wrote an executive summary in the front of the binder that read like a table of contents and a timeline at once. Dates, locations, and why each entry mattered. I added a chain of custody sheet for key pieces, photocopies timestamped with a third-party service and a notarized attestation about where the originals would stay. I printed QR codes that linked to read-only versions of the repository so anyone with a phone could see the evidence without me distributing originals. I embedded plain-language narratives under each key exhibit so a casual reader could follow cause and effect. This payment, then that repair, then the donation. I drafted affidavits for Leo and Ruth using templates from a legal clinic and then had a volunteer paralegal sit with them while they read and edited their statements line by line. They insisted on small changes. Leo wanted the exact phrasing of what he'd been told to sign. Ruth wanted her letters included as exhibits, so we honored their edits. The affidavits were notarized and sealed in envelopes with chain of custody stickers. I also secured a pro bono attorney willing to file a motion to vacate Leo's plea and to prepare for civil discovery. The lawyer insisted on copies of everything and on a schedule for rolling productions so nothing would look like a hurried dump. I agreed. I built redundancy into everything. Maya Brooks, the reporter I trusted, got a pre-publication packet under embargo with clear timestamps, copies of the notarized affidavits, and secure links. I left mirrored copies with 2 other editors and with a tech-savvy friend who could post them if Maya's feeds were blocked. For legal contact, I prepared a concise referral packet for Susan Bennett, the state attorney general, formatted to match what a public office expects: clear exhibits, contact names, and a single-page summary. I arranged for a delivery to land in her office at the exact time the ceremony would begin, because timing would matter as much as content. Infiltrating the wedding was logistics disguised as humility. I applied to the contracted florist as an extra prep hand and took a 2-day shift in their prep warehouse. The uniform and the vendor badge bought me access and the right to move crates without question. I learned the venue's load-in schedule, where vendors parked and which door staff used to access the sound rack. I timed the vendor arrivals and memorized the room's breaker panels. It's amazing how quickly a person learns the shape of a building when they pretend to be a helper. I duplicated the printed program on matching paper, then folded in my variant. The same design, but with a 4-page insert tucked into the back. The insert had the executive summary, a QR code linking to the repository, and an excerpt from one of Ruth's letters. I practiced the swap route with a florist assistant during a lull in prep. Wheel in the cart, place a crate by the welcome table, move the box of programs behind the cart, slide the new stack into the basket when the photographer called for family photos. I timed the move to coincide with the photographer's shout for the sisters' shot because that moment would thin the vendor staff and create the perfect distraction. The micro audio player was small and dumb-looking, the kind that could be tucked beneath a lectern shelf and fed into a mixer with a 3.5mm cable. I preloaded it with Ruth's recorded letter and a short-spoken timeline. I tested it on the console at the venue during a vendor check-in, then taped the device under the lectern shelf where the connector hid among a nest of identical wires. I made a simple toggle, a piece of gaffer tape that could be pulled to activate the feed if someone toggled the wrong input. The trick was to make the device look like part of the normal clutter so no one would single it out during load-in. I printed lanyards and vendor badges for 2 assistants, Leo and a freelance stringer Maya trusted, to move freely through vendor corridors. The lanyards let them carry boxes, approach the lectern, and swap programs without arousing suspicion. I scoped the floor plan so the photographer's path and the main camera's line of sight intersected at the moment I needed them to. Family photos. I rehearsed, in my head, the exact second to make the swap so the QR insert would sit in the hands of donors and family alike as they posed for the official photos. Coordinating media and legal timing felt like syncing watches before an operation. I met Maya in a cafe and placed a sealed envelope on the table with documents and passcodes only she would open when I texted one word. Ready? We agreed on a 2-stage release. The first stage would be the program insert and the QR landing page going live the moment the bridal party stepped into their photo lineup. The second stage would be the article with embedded documents and Ruth's audio to publish the second the officiant opened the envelope we would leave on his lectern. We agreed on embargo times, backup outlets, and a legal safe word in case something went off script. I prepared the packet for Susan Bennett by condensing the binders into a single, clear referral, the dates, the exhibits, and the contact for Leo and Ruth. I also left a calendar with proposed hearing dates and a motion template for vacating a plea. The goal wasn't to take the officer of the law by surprise, but to give them an organized referral they could act on immediately. Time matters to offices, and I wanted theirs to be an easier box to check than ignoring it. I set up mirrored drop folders and an automatic publish queue with Maya so if one feed was blocked, other editors would post. I also had a trusted friend ready to put the documents to a public archive in case legal pressure tried to suppress them. We thought through contingencies, a viral takedown, a threatened lawsuit, a sudden private settlement attempt. For each, we had a response template and a next step. I did not want emotion in those replies, I wanted facts and witnesses. The countermoves began the moment Maya first called Dad's office with questions. Graham Pike, Dad's crisis fixer, showed up quickly with a measured voice and a printed cease and desist. He framed it as a courtesy. "You need to stop this or we'll see you in court." His emails were formal and polite but designed to intimidate. They named defamation, malicious interference, and threatened to subpoena third-party hosts. I saved every voicemail and forwarded it to Maya. She uploaded the audio to a secure drive and informed her legal department. We did not respond to threats in kind, we documented them. Mom texted me in the thin hours pleading, "We can be a family again if you drop this." The message was crafted to make me responsible for keeping peace. I archived it and printed a screenshot. Lydia tried a different tack. She called with the offer of hush money and the promise of being sisters again. She sounded rehearsed, the way someone practicing an apology sounds. I asked her to put offers in writing and she huffed, then hung up. Each attempt at private bargaining became another piece of evidence I photographed and logged. Someone followed me after a few of my meetings. I noticed a man in a gray suit outside the coffee shop 3 times in 1 week. I went into a grocery store and watched his reflection in the freezer glass, took a photograph of his face and the license plate that passed in the road, and sent both to a friend with the caption, "Seen? I changed routes and varied meeting locations. I kept my phone on but recorded every voicemail from unknown numbers." At night, I placed 3 physical packets labeled open if unreachable, one with a stringer, one with Maya, one in a safe deposit so others could act if I disappeared. A legal slug from Graham arrived as a preemptive heavy threat of a lawsuit and demands to preserve all communications. It was familiar territory: intimidate, delay, drown in legal costs. We installed an answer that was simple. We stand by our reporting. We will cooperate with lawful inquiries. Maya's legal team handled the direct replies and served as a buffer. I never wrote to the firm directly. I let lawyered words do that. That way, every aggressive message Graham sent was another item we could cite in a pattern of intimidation. When Mom sent a last-ditch text offering family at any cost, I poked holes in it with a photograph of Ruth's letter and a note. "You had a chance to answer this." I didn't expect a reply, I expected a reaction. It came as a legal storm that first threatened, then tried to reframe the narrative, and finally sought to bury it with non-disclosure proposals. We declined anything that would silence Ruth or prohibit Leo's counsel from filing for relief. The pro bono attorney filed the motion to vacate Leo's plea the day after the wedding. The motion cited coercion and new evidence. It referenced the ledger and the foundation payment. Filing it felt like putting a boot on a leak. It made the process official and gave courts a reason to look. Surviving the countermoves was less about being brave than it was about being organized and boringly thorough. I photographed every page, saved every text, time-stamped everything. I kept backups in multiple places, wrote straightforward memos for anyone who might be called as a witness, and practiced short, factual replies to any public question. I prepared a 20-second statement I would use if asked by a reporter or confronted at the venue. "I have documents and witnesses. I stand by them." No grand speeches, no accusations without proof. The simplicity made the message harder to mischaracterize. At night, I reviewed the casebook and added small annotations, where an exhibit might be vulnerable to attack, which witness needed independent corroboration, what the likely cross-examination angles were. I slept in fits and starts, but with a checklist beside my bed. The work required tradecraft more than theater: chains of custody, notarizations, redundant deliveries, and a press timing that made private suppression difficult. That structure kept panic at bay. Each countermove they tried, threats, charm, surveillance, only underscored why we were doing what we were doing. It hardened my resolve and tightened the net of witnesses. The plan had teeth. Documents, voices, public records, and a reporter ready to publish on schedule. It also had humane edges: protections for Leo, a platform for Ruth, and a legal path for corrective filings. In the end, the thing that kept me steady was the simple arithmetic of facts plus witnesses. They had weaponized silence for years. I was learning how to weaponize exposure in the service of a truth someone should have offered years ago. The audio rack was behind a curtained door with a security sticker and a hiss of static when the text tested levels. I crouched by the console under the pretense of helping a tech roll cable and made a careful study. Main input here, backup feed there, mute toggles under a strip of gaffer tape, an extra patch bay that would let me route a small 3.5mm line into the house left if I could find the right jacks. I tucked the micro audio player into my apron and felt its small weight like a secret. I watched how the text labeled channels, handwritten names, numbers circled in red, then copied them into my own phone notes. At the welcome table, the program boxes sat like art books. I moved crates under the guise of restocking and opened one to restock candles. My prepared programs were in a plain brown box disguised with a florist sticker. I slid them into place behind the official stacks, arranged a late bloom of roses across the table to catch light, and stacked the original programs on the cart I would wheel out during photos. Vendors kept to their lanes. Nobody watched a florist's hands as long as there were ribbons to tie. I checked the lectern and found the underside roomy enough to hide the tiny player. The wires there were a nest, and one more would go unnoticed. I taped the player under the shelf and threaded the cable into the nest, leaving the end loose like a tail. I placed the sealed envelopes, those meant for the efficient and key donors, into folders I'd fabricated to look like venue paperwork. The head table chargers had napkins folded the way I'd practiced, and beneath one napkin sat a thin envelope with a printed summary and a QR sticky tucked inside. The lanyard badges for Leo and the stringer were clipped to a clipboard. They looked official enough to move. I signaled Maya with a one-word text, and she responded with an emoji I'd taught her, the green check. That check meant the mirrored articles were staged, the secure folders active, and the attorney had the motion draft ready. The room was a machine of small, practiced movements, vases lifted, chairs aligned, microphones checked, and I felt like a minor cog until I completed the circuit. When family photos began, vendors clustered near the entrance pretending to adjust a bouquet or fold a napkin. It's a neat trick. People assume the real action is on the stage. The photographer called for the big sister's shot, and in 3 seconds the room thinned as guests stood and shuffled into place. I wheeled the cart with the fresh program stack and, with the confidence of someone who places items for a living, slid my crafted packets into the satin baskets. The QR code sits on the back of a page people rarely read, but hands fidget, pages turn, and a curious donor lifts the card to see the embossed script. Phones come out of pockets like moths to a porch light. The landing page loaded before the photographer finished counting down. The QR guided people to a clean, mobile-friendly timeline, scanned exhibits, and a short audio clip that introduced Ruth's voice. I watched a man in a blue blazer lean toward his wife and whisper, then look up with an expression that asks, "Is this a joke?" A dozen subtle screens brightened in the dim room as people scanned and forwarded and compared. The planner frowned at the misplaced inserts but was trying to suppress any public fuss. No one wants a scandal before the champagne is poured. Texts appeared as small eruptions. Check this, is that the senator? Turn this off. The first wave hit with the casual ferocity of the internet. Curiosity, then disbelief, then the small, spreading tremor of concern. I had rehearsed the slideshow switch like a musician practices a tricky measure. The AV tech was a young man with tired eyes. I offered a helpful note, "Your left channel's clipping," and he bent over the console to adjust levels. When he leaned in, I reached under the lectern, pulled the gaffer tape as if clearing a stray wire, and with a subtle tug routed my micro player to the backup bus. The cue I had embedded in the sisters' montage was timed to begin the second the music swelled. It started like a key opening, unobtrusive at first, then Ruth's voice filled the speakers. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Turner, I wrote after my son Evan died at dawn." The words landed slow and crisp against the acoustics, a human sound inside the polished room. The music cut out mid-phrase and the spoken letter took the space as if it had always belonged there. I watched faces change as if someone had turned the lights up. Mom's hand flew to her mouth, Dad's forehead creased. Lydia's smile flickered and held. The AV tech hit mute and nothing happened. The backup feed carried that voice straight through. Forks froze over plates, champagne glasses paused mid-lift. People who had come for spectacle found themselves in a listening room, bearing witness without asking to be. The recording read the letter plainly, without the tone that could be edited into sentiment. It was just a mother speaking into a microphone, and in that simplicity it was devastating. I saw the planner's eye find the electrician. She mouthed, "Pull it," like a stage manager, but that pull would have to trace wiring I had already obscured with cable ties. The photographer cursed under his breath and fumbled with his camera. Flashes went off in a jitter that looked almost like blinking out of shock. Somewhere in the crowd, a child asked a question the way children do. "Who is she?" And an aunt shushed him without answering. The room became a kind of jury without charge, and I sat at the console with my hands steady while Ruth kept reading. When the officiant cracked the embossed envelope at his lectern, he did not expect a briefing. He flipped the page and read aloud the single sheet I had placed there, a short, stark summary with dates, names, and a pointed question about blessing a family under active inquiry. The microphone was live and the cameras were rolling, the senator's voice caught clean and public. He began to read the dates and the donation amounts, his practiced cadence catching on the word donation as if it had gained weight. You could see the room take him in like a theater audience realizing the plot had a twist. He tried to frame it as a pause for clarity, we should address this, but his pause turned into a breath that the world heard. I walked up with my vendor lanyard still visible and, without theatrics, told him the originals were time-stamped and placed where they could be verified. His hand trembled the tiniest degree when he returned the paper to the folder. His staff began low-voiced counsel-speak into earpieces. Andrew's jaw tightened and Lydia leaned forward as if to close a book. The moment expanded into a public question that couldn't be folded back into private hands. The officiant asked for a brief pause. He looked at me as if I had somehow altered the contract of the day. I nodded at him because the rest of the room needed a signal that there was no chaos here, only things finally visible. An auto-response from the Attorney General's office pinged my burner. We acknowledge receipt of referral and will review. I forwarded it to the Senator's Chief of Staff and to an editorial contact at the paper, making sure the moment could be confirmed as having been delivered to the proper offices. The timelines we had crafted knit together in real time. Laura's article, the notarized affidavits, the motion draft for Leo. People in the room who hadn't yet scanned a program now fumbled with their phones to find the same document strangers were already arguing over online. Graham Pike tried to turn the temperature down with a show of calm that had nothing behind it. He strode across the floor with a printed letter in hand and a smile that sought to be soothing. We contest the accuracy of any suggestion of wrongdoing, he said loudly enough for a nearby table to hear, then leaned the letter at a donor as if that would reframe the narrative as mere rumor. His lawyer's tone wanted to buy time. The problem for him was the documents in the hands of multiple reporters and the notarized statements already living in secure mirrored servers. Threats to sue are easier when the other party is quiet. They are harder when evidence is stacked and time-stamped. The senator's aides circled him like guards. He stepped away from the lectern with a careful, official face and conferred with a public relations advisor whose whispered words were abrupt and sharp. Staffers hustled, messages were passed, and the senator decided to postpone the ceremony in a way that looked like careful deliberation rather than panic. Cameras followed his exit. The optics of a man who would be recorded later that week explaining why he had stepped away would make a different kind of trouble than a private phone call. Reporters circled, microphones extended, and the feedback loop of public scrutiny closed. Lydia tried to intercept me in a hallway that smelled like lemon cleaner and treaded carpet. Her voice was a braid of charm and anger. "Miriam, please," she said, hands reaching as though for a reconciliation rehearsed in movies. "This has to stop. You don't understand what this does to people." Her eyes flashed with the old calculation they had been trained, and she offered in the low voice of a negotiator money and a future that included me if I would drop it. I told her calmly that offers had to be written. She huffed and left as if I had insulted her with formality. Her retreat said more than any barbed comment could. Andrew kept close to his mother, pressing his jaw as if compressing the day into a shape he could manage. Dad tried a different tack. He stepped forward, voice steady, to speak with the senator's team and a photographer who had lingered. His charm was the kind that had once bought favors. Now his charm was a work in progress that found resistance at every turn. Donors texted each other while their faces flushed. Board chairs excused themselves to make private calls. The room emptied into clusters of whispering people trying to triangulate what to say to their spouses and to their boards. Security politely disengaged Graham when his insistence shifted from firm to threatening. He left, mouth a thin line. Outside, he paced, then climbed into a car with a man whose tie was too bright for the city. For all his resourcefulness, his fixes were blunt instruments against a messy, public thing. The lawyered letters, the quick phone calls to sympathetic editors, the offers of private settlements, those were the playbook of men who tried to remove problems by moving them under a rug. But a rug can't hide a stain that is talked about at scale. The immediate fallout was a study in how quickly a curated life unravels when the veneer cracks. The senator's paws stretched. The planner announced an intermission that people would interpret in different ways, a break, a cancellation, or an excuse. Guests left their seats and formed knots near entrances, phones in hands like compasses. Two donors' names that mattered to Dad made furtive calls and then left together, their departure like the removal of a pillar. The band packed in an hour, tables were left with uneaten salads and candles still burning. The cake, displayed like a prop, blurred in the background as conversations turned serious. The Turners' phones began to ring in a different register, friends asking, donors probing, board members quietly seeking answers. Mom's face shrank into something the camera couldn't unsee, practiced sympathy collapsing into real-time panic. Dad's jaw dropped in a way that made him look smaller than his Rolodex had ever made him appear. Lydia, in a dress that suited magazine spreads, anchored herself to Andrew as if proximity could dispel rumor. She looked younger with each passing minute, like a person caught between training and astonishment. By the time I walked back into the sunlight, script in hand and a chest that had stopped aching, the news cycle had already consumed the moment. Reporters lined the steps outside the venue. Cars idled in a lane where donors debated whether to stay for damage control or to salvage reputations. The planner shook her head at the disruption and told me quietly to leave. I signed out on my vendor sheet with the same calm I had used when signing in. My vendor polo felt like armor that had done its job. The legal repercussions moved faster than I'd expected. The Attorney General's office announced a preliminary inquiry within 48 hours, citing new information about possible obstruction, misuse of charitable funds, and witness tampering. The phrasing was careful, the office must sound neutral, but the action itself mattered. Investigators from the Attorney General's team issued subpoenas for foundation records and the body shop's ledger. Those subpoenas were the kind of slow, steady pressure that forces documents into daylight. The foundation's bank accounts were flagged for review, and auditors arrived with clipboards and polite questions that had the weight of compulsion behind them. Leo's pro bono attorney filed a motion to vacate his obstruction plea the next business day, citing newly surfaced documents and indications of coercion. The court clerk accepted the filing with a polite nod that felt like a small triumph. The motion referenced the ledger entry we had unearthed and the foundation donation that coincided with the time of the incident. The bookkeeper's small claims exhibit became a surprising linchpin. Someone in the county clerk's office told me, off the record, that clerks often see what others miss when records are complained about. It was bureaucratic, dull, and ultimately hard to argue with. Investigators served the body shop with records demands and within a week seized financial ledgers for forensic review. The Shell nonprofit's treasurer resigned and then gave an interview that read like a remorseful script. The foundation suspended philanthropic activity pending review, which was the public relations version of closing the doors. Donors withdrew pledges or asked for suspensions until auditors issued public findings. Board members who had once been happy to lend a name to a cause began to distance themselves, citing governance concerns. The Turners' network shuddered under the weight of paperwork. A civil suit from Ruth was filed soon after, amended to include allegations that had not been in the initial complaint, claims about misdirection of charitable funds and interference with an ongoing police matter. Ruth's attorney crafted the filing to keep pressure on agencies and to preserve discovery rights. The suit's public nature meant settlements would be visible, not quiet. The police department issued a statement acknowledging the receipt of new evidence and requesting additional witnesses to come forward. For the first time since the hit and run, the case had institutional teeth behind it beyond the grief of a woman in a small apartment. Dad's foundation issued a statement that read like a practiced contraction: "We are cooperating fully with inquiries." It looked like contrition and functioned like a lifeline, but auditors had already pulled transactional histories that showed patterns curious enough to warrant subpoenas. The body shop's owner, when questioned, invoked a lawyer and produced suddenly reticent answers. The small town's gossip turned into a pattern that agencies could follow: a donation here, a cash ledger entry there, a plea vacated if evidence showed coercion or misrepresentation. It was not dramatic in a cinematic sense, it was mechanics of institutions doing their job when presented with a paper trail and witnesses. There were also quieter corrections. Leo got the first legal help he'd been promised years ago. Ruth obtained a hearing for expedited discovery into the foundation's records. The county clerk's office turned over cached documents that connected vendors to foundation disbursements. Each subpoena and each filed motion was a small, irreversible shift from curated silence to documented accountability. The city began to murmur about who would sit on boards next year and what it meant to donate to causes run by people who expected silence in return. In the days that followed, public opinion stratified around the documents and the witnesses. Some believed our packet immediately, others called it opportunistic. The Turners tried to rally friends and bolster narratives of private pain, but public records do not speak in pity. They speak in dates and numbers and signatures. The legal system moved slower than a mother's grief, but faster than a family's ability to reweave its image. I did not gloat. I watched with a careful detachment as processes took their course because I had seen enough small documents tip big outcomes. Witnesses had weight now, and institutions were beginning to do what they are supposed to: ask for receipts and stories in equal measure. Andrew's family machine tucked itself away like a photograph removed from a wall. A spokesperson issued a calm statement about postponing the wedding to ensure all questions are answered, and their political allies quietly advised distance. The campaign aides who once smiled at Dad's jokes stopped returning calls. Vendors who had chased Turner's checks for years began to leak small, anonymous stories about awkward late payments and private dinners where issues were handled. The planner I had worked with told me privately that she had been ghosted by 50 clients who didn't want to be near a scandal. She asked if there was anything she could do for Ruth. People ask for favors when they're ready to be kind. Firms started to uninvite the Turners from events. Invitations stopped arriving in embossed envelopes and were replaced by informational emails about governance reviews and compliance audits. Donor clubs that had welcomed Mom's chairmanship now sent polite notes about policies and possible suspensions. The foundation's board called an emergency meeting, and within days the foundation released a terse statement. Operations suspended pending review. That suspension looked like a lock on a door, public and final. There were whispers that some board officers were talking quietly about insurance and indemnities and how reputations cost less when you remove them early. I listened to those whispers at a distance and cataloged them like receipts. Social media did its small, relentless work. Old photos with Lydia positioned at the center were scrubbed. Friends who once liked every post about Turner's philanthropy quietly removed tags. The sisters' montage that had been a polished narrative became an object lesson in PR polishing gone wrong. PR forums used the wedding as a case study for what not to do. Board chairs texted each other and decided they wanted no association with people who might invite legal headaches. It was surgical and it was thorough because wealth depends on reputation, and reputation is a fragile, expensive thing. Money moved away first and then influence followed. Board members resigned, donors froze gifts, vendors blacklisted the family as a risk. A handful of long-time supporters called with measured voices. They were sorry but cautious. Some offered to mediate, others asked for refunds. The Turners' networks, which had been a web of favors and introductions, folded inward like a collapsing tent. The people who had once opened doors for Mom and Dad now closed them, often with the very politeness the family had used for so long. It felt like a public exhale. For many of those families, it was finally easier to step back than to be dragged through a story that named them by association. Reparations took strange, uneven shapes. Ruth insisted on public restitution that felt like justice because it could not be hidden. Her civil suit moved forward with claims about misdirected foundation funds and witness interference, and settlement offers that once would have been taken in private began to require public terms. Donors redirected gifts to Evan's scholarship. The money that once polished Mom's events flowed instead into a community that needed a track and a coach. Leo received the first job offer that honored him rather than punished him. A front-of-house position at a cafe where the manager had seen his affidavit on the news and wanted someone honest and steady. Watching him accept the offer, quiet, embarrassed, relieved, felt like an ordinary miracle. Ruth recorded a new letter to Evan in my presence. She sat at her kitchen table that smelled of lemon and old wood and read slowly into a cheap recorder I had brought, the words a mixture of grief and late relief. "You were heard," she said, and the phrase landed in the room like a bell. We played that recording at a small gathering at the track where Evan had run. People who had known him placed flowers where the cones marked his best time. It was private and small and exact. The gestures weren't meant to erase what had happened, but to prove that someone remembered him without the gloss of a press photo. I got a check for research work from Maya that wasn't large but felt like currency for being seen. It wasn't about money so much as acknowledgement. Someone had valued what I'd done. I used part of it to put a small sum into a fund for Leo to help with moving expenses and the rest into the scholarship Ruth had insisted her son's name carry. I mailed Mom and Dad one envelope, a copy of Ruth's first unanswered letter and a short note, "You had a chance to answer this." I didn't expect them to reply. I wasn't asking for anything in return. I wanted them to have a record they could not pretend not to have seen. I kept no trophies. I didn't take centerpieces or ribbons. I returned the spare vendor lanyards to the florist with a thank you note and a tip. Closure, to me, didn't look like vindication ceremonies or loud announcements. It looked like small, concrete acts: Leo's job, Ruth's recorded words, a scholarship with Evan's name on it. Those things felt like repair by measure. They weren't about making me feel better so much as making sure the harms were visible and that the people hurt had a path out of that harm. The casebook went into a locked safety deposit box for a while and then into a plain cardboard box labeled complete. I kept a single digital mirror in encrypted storage and moved on with work that paid less than it had when I was a Turner, but paid enough to let me sleep without looking over my shoulder. I returned to research assignments, nonprofit audits, historical digging, document retrievals, and found that the kind of patience I had learned in the archive translated into small freelance gigs. People would email because Maya had mentioned me. Editors wanted someone who could find a receipt and tell a story with it. It was a different kind of currency. I stopped checking Mom and Dad's feeds. I blocked numbers in a way that felt like closing windows in a house with too many rooms. Silence no longer meant being invisible. It meant choosing not to be summoned by people who had once tried to define me. If acquaintances asked about reconciliation, I said, no, I didn't elaborate. Boundaries are boring sentences said often until they hold. I liked the sound of my name when it wasn't attached to their expectations. The old family script had been broken in a way that could not easily be put back together. They could still keep their manners and their dresses, but they had lost the narrative control they'd assumed was immutable. That power had been redistributed by documents and witnesses and by a mother's voice read on a mic in a room full of people who could no longer pretend not to hear. For me, the victory was procedural and austere. A plea vacated, subpoenas served, a scholarship funded, a mother heard. I kept a small routine. I made my coffee the way I liked it, black, strong, walked to the archive on days I had a project, and answered emails with plain sentences. I walked past a glass-walled cafe and saw a family posing for photos, and the image didn't pull me apart the way it might have before. I had been in rooms where people decided who could exist and who could be erased. Now I only sat on the edges of those rooms for work and left when I had to. If anyone asked about my family, I would say, I'm protecting a name that wasn't mine. Now I protect my own. People listened differently when I said it like that. I did not gloat. There was no satisfaction in watching a table clear. What I carried forward was a steadiness that came from knowing what it took to make people show their cards. Patience, documents, witnesses. I kept the casebook in a box in the back of my closet and began a new binder labeled work with clients' names in neat hand. The world still offered small cruelties. I learned to buffer them with practice rather than fury. There were mornings when I felt the old ache of being invisible, but those mornings passed faster than before. If you've ever been cut out to protect someone else's image, tell me in the comments. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more true-to-life revenge stories, and check the next video queued up for you on this channel.